No.
Now the world don't move to the beat of just one drum. What might be right for you may not.
Wait, what? They're gonna want more arguments than that? Oh, come on, do I really need to? What is this, high school debate club?
The North Star here is transgenderism is a mental health disorder.
Good one, she/her. The internet will never fix your real threat, depression.
Transgenderism is a mental disorder.
If you have a mental disorder, that's fine. I don't need to come up to you and tell you that I think you have a mental disorder. That would be rude.
Right.
But when you have a mental disorder and you're now requiring that I have a mental disorder, right, to meet your mental disorder, that doesn't work for me.
Conservatives are the best. I love them, such lovely people. They pay so much attention to the well-being of minorities in general. They're always concerned about the sexual health of women and the mental health of transgender people. They care so much. Where would we be without them? One of the latest examples of conservative kindness was real-life Tony Stark, haver of multiple gender reaffirming surgeries and 5-time Father of the Year nominee Elon Musk, who went on record to talk about his daughter's transition. He was so concerned that the person he described as a slightly autistic gay boy went on to be poisoned by the woke mind virus and ended up taking very dangerous drugs against her better judgment. Such a loving and caring father. I'm sure all of his concerns are genuine. This interview was shared everywhere online until his daughter, Vivian, replied saying that everything her dad said is false. He wouldn't know anything about her childhood because he wasn't there, and told her now disowned father to stop with his ketamine-fueled haze and go touch some grass.
I'm not just a bitch. I'm a bitch with a backstory.
Vivian said that the thing she thought was the most funny was Elon's slightly autistic comment. She said she didn't even know where he got this from. Probably from the Milo Yiannopoulos School of Gay Stereotypes. Just picked a random one and said, good enough. She never had a love of musicals and theater. She hated Hamilton. She never picked up fabulous jackets for him to wear. The whole thing is made up. He doesn't know what I was like as a child because he quite simply wasn't there. I was relentlessly harassed for my femininity and queerness. Obviously, he can't say that. So I've been reduced to a happy little stereotype fagging along to use at his discretion. Such a concerned and caring father. But okay, let's give a second thought to the subject now. Why are conservatives really that concerned about whether trans people are going through mental struggles or not? Is it out of a real interest in our well-being and to guarantee we will have access to the healthcare we deserve? Musk himself has talked about the common association between identifying as transgender and autism, and some weird comments on my videos sure love to remind me about correlations between transness and depression and high unaliving rates. They seem so concerned. Why else would they bring this up? I'm not sure if you, dear stranger line, have noticed this already, but I have the impression that there are quite a few people who don't really dig the idea that trans people are a thing. I don't know, it's crazy. It might be because the fact that we have the autonomy to radically define what is expected of our bodies is a powerful challenge against a very strict model of binarity that reinforces most of the power relations in a patriarchal, capital-centered society, or because we just kinda give them the ick. I don't know. But it looks like they don't really vibe with us. So, could it be that maybe they need to have an excuse to say that we don't have the right to be as we are? A reason to force us to conform to how they want us to be and obey a rigid structure. Of course, you cannot force a consenting adult to not transition, but maybe by saying, ooh, poor children, they will be influenced by you to form their own identities, or you people are all freaks and also autistic, and also it's just mental illness when you are something but you believe you are something else. Then maybe they could strip away our power to wear a skirt that goes spinny. Like, fair point, right? We trans people go around identifying as chairs or attack helicopters. At some point, people will start wondering if we have, something not working properly up here. A few months ago, I released my most popular video on this channel yet, which was a story about a 20-year-old esports player saying that they respect gay and lesbian people, but would never support people changing their gender. In their own words, changing gender is a mental illness. It's a really bold statement to say, mostly when you have absolutely nothing backing it up, and I shrugged it off because I didn't want to dive deep into research and arguments and read psychiatry theory to answer my own personal question of what is really a sickness of the mind. Brains are super complicated. Even people who dedicate their entire lives to studying neuroscience seem to have a hard time understanding how the brain works because it's weird and oftentimes makes no sense. If that's the case, how can we define when it's behaving properly or not? How can somebody just step out of the blue and say, this is a normal mind? That was not my focus on that video, and I was called out in the comment section by some people saying that I was avoiding the question, but not today, babes. Today we are in for a ride. Today I'm giving you my best capabilities as an aspiring video essayist. Today we are quoting Foucault. Today we are going elbows deep in Marxist theory, and we are going to look at some of the most horrendous crimes ever committed in the history of humanity. Today is one of those days, so please remember there is a very big trigger warning for this video. We will literally tick all the boxes in this one, I'm serious. According to the American Psychiatry Association, a mental illness is... Actually, I don't care. And spoiler alert, they don't care either. In this video, dear stranger online, I will entertain the idea that accusing trans people of not having full mental capacity is nothing more than an excuse to take away our right to make decisions or have autonomy over our bodies. If we were, for lack of a better word, mentally unwell, this would mean we would suddenly need to have our actions policed and our ability to define our identities put into questioning. And that's such a funny hill to die on, right? Because I don't remember ever being really delusional about anything. I don't think I'm an attack helicopter, and neither have I ever met somebody who does. Never ever did I have the impression that my organs are not the ones that they are, or that my chromosomes are any different than what my test results said. Actually, it's funny to talk about chromosomes because trans people will often have to have theirs checked out before going into HRT. Cis people instead can go through their entire lives and never once have their chromosomes brought into a single conversation, never even know for sure which chromosomes a test would reveal to them. I keep thinking, like, if we all of a sudden decide to test everyone just for the funsies, I'm sure a few gender critical accounts online would be in for a huge surprise. But now, chromosome reveal party. For me to say that I have been tested and confirmed to have XY chromosomes and I still want to use she, her pronouns? There must be something deeply wrong with my brain. Should I receive a diagnosis? Be put inside a pathology? Trans people know who we are. We know we exist in a segregated and marginal social class, separated from cisgenderness. We are very well aware of the material reality of our bodies and our places in society. I am a woman because I live the life of a woman. I am socially perceived as a woman, and I am treated by everyone around me, including multiple national states, as a woman. You can notice that I never mentioned that I live the life of a cis woman, and I'm aware I don't in a lot of small ways that, frankly, don't bother me in the slightest. But the life I live is the one I always wanted, and I wouldn't change it for anything. But enough about me. Let's talk about the school anarchist scene about the other day.
What makes something a disease or a syndrome? My body changes, yet diagnoses are so permanent, so easy to throw around, so hard to shake off. Are you trying to say something is broken so that it can be fixed? Also, it's about what's normal? Who decides what's normal? What is normal? Too much testosterone? Who says? Large ovaries? Larger than what? More hair than what? Oh, it's about fertility. You're worried I can't make babies? Is that a problem for me? Or do you really mean it's a problem for you? Oh, the state needs baby-making machines, but not everyone qualifies for the job. Is the fertility of some more valuable than the fertility of others?
I was at a transgender art fair the other day, and the zine basically gravitated towards me. It was an almost mythical, fateful encounter, as if the zine found me while writing this very difficult script. One in which I am talking about things I'm certainly not an expert for. Because of this, I've been trying very hard to find voices of other people to replace mine with. It is a very powerful read. It's called What the Hill by Good Almighty on Instagram. They write about their frustrating personal experiences with medicalization, doctor visits, being put on different pills, waiting months for appointments, and getting different diagnoses from different specialists. They write that diagnoses call human experiences disorders. The fact is that what is considered a disorder changes historically because, surprise, surprise, diseases are socially constructed. And I'm not even talking about subjective, girly mental diseases. I'm talking also about illnesses that you might consider an observable and measurable fact. In capitalism, what we consider a disease is something that would prevent us from being proper producing members for the capital. Take astigmatism. It's an observable imperfection, right? An error in the curvature of the eye that we can see and measure. But what is the perfect eye? Who defined what the shape of an eye should be? When does a human eye become too curved? Reality is, astigmatism was never even a thing in any agricultural society because when your value is based on how good of a farmer you are, you might go your entire life without noticing that you see things a little bit differently from the rest. But if you perhaps live in a militarized society where your duty as a citizen is to have perfect aim, then astigmatism becomes a pathology, and we need to fix it. I also came across the book Empire of Normality, written by Robert Chapman, a philosopher and social theorist focusing on neurodiversity, madness, and disability. They're also autistic. Chapman argues that neuronormativity is inherently linked to capitalism. Similarly to the astigmatism example, this doesn't mean that before capitalism there were no people with mental impairments, but that the pressure to produce and create value and conform to the really tight rules of what it means to be normal today are specifically capitalist. There is an emphasis on competition between workers and everyone is ranked against each other. There are more desirable abilities and there are incapacitating disabilities. And the demand of capitalism for a reserve army of labor ensured that if you had any one of these disabilities, there was no work for you. Capitalism doesn't work if everyone has a job, you know? Unemployment is a necessary tool to keep workers scared and obedient. Chapman also argues that even if you want to work in Starbucks, talking to customers and taking orders, it is labor that demands cognitive and affective skills that were never really needed in the past. They describe post-Fordism as a mass disabling event. In the past, these people would never be considered disabled. Now they are. And honestly, how can you accuse a brain that is anxious of being atypical when it's being fed terabytes of information daily of a threatening world that changes rapidly and demands our undivided attention? Is anxiety or ADHD an atypical way for a brain to react to that? Is depression atypical, even after receiving hate comments by the hundreds, after seeing people you love being attacked and your political rights being taken away? Is that an atypical way for a brain to react? Because I think that is the most typical thing to expect in the world. I came across Chapman's work because I was really annoyed with the use of the word neurotypical, which would imply a typical functioning of the brain. Which is a little bit silly in my opinion, because going back to our initial issue, this doesn't really exist, and it is constructed purely socially. Chapman explains that was kind of the idea of the word. Its first use is attributed to autistic advocate Laura Tisancic in her spoof website, Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical. On this website, as Tisancic recalls, a range of autistic writers picked apart characteristics of neurotypical individuals in the same patronizing, pathologizing voice, in which traits commonly held by autistic people are described, with feigned obliviousness to how such traits might also be useful. This is perhaps why Chapman uses the term neurodiversity, which I personally like better. They claim it's supposed to be an analogy to biodiversity. In the same way that biodiversity must be protected from capital, we need to value neurodiversity and try to change the world in ways to support these people, not the other way around. An ecosystem is most healthy when biodiversity is high. Neurodiversity describes resistance to the force and pressure of normalcy. And hear me, I know about the allegations and I can't beat them. I was actually quite happy to find a non-binary person writing about autism because I cannot ignore the elephant in the room. I am far from being the first person to point out the link between transgender identities and neurodiversity. If being transgender is not a malfunction of the mind, how can I explain the fact that it often comes side by side with other, for lack of a better word, diagnoses such as autism and depression? I might not like them as much as Kamala does, but hell, I do love myself a good Venn diagram.
I love Venn diagrams.
And the intersection between neurodiversity and gender diverse people is difficult to deny. Well, like every Venn diagram, there are a lot of people who are outside of the intersection.
Analysis about where there is the intersection, right?
Take me, for example. I might own a suspicious amount of Pokemon plushies, but I'm not an autistic person. Also, regardless of what the automatically hidden YouTube comments might try to imply, never ever in my life have I even come close to any kind of ideation of doing bad stuff to myself. My therapist even said she wouldn't be concerned because that is definitely not my vibe. She told me I'm too vain for that. If you're not a trans person online, you might not know about this, but it is astonishing how weaponized the data around transgender depression and unaliving rates are. Right-wings and transphobes are extremely vile. It doesn't matter what you are posting about, it doesn't matter if you are just living your life. A weirdo will appear out of nowhere and start commenting numbers and data and statistics regarding trans under your posts. When it happened to me, some person commented a random number and I had to Google it to know what they were talking about, like extremely chronic online behavior. It's heartless and cruel and horrible, and it is exactly this kind of online persecution partnered with low family acceptance, employability challenges, and organized political movements against our right to be who we are that makes those depression numbers spike even more. As for autism, according to a study made by a bunch of clever people, trans people are 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic, and really there is no direct or hard explanation for why. But it's often said it could be the other way around. A person who is already marginalized as outside of normality, a person who doesn't really get or abide by strict socially constructed rules, might be way more likely to figure out that this whole binary gender thing is all a tad bit silly. Almost like an outsider's perspective. And as we have more and more queer and trans people, we also have more and more neurodiverse people. And it's the same reason why we have more and more left-handed people. Because we now have a platform. We now can talk to each other. We now can recognize that the individual experiences and feelings we have are not unique to us. Other people also experience it and they have a name for that. And even though it's completely understandable that capitalism is conditioning us more and more to develop depression, ADHD, and other conditions, it is also important to remember that these are still disabilities. It is important to remember that there are people who are in deep mental suffering and they need access to help and healthcare. Chapman says that sometimes when people say, I have ADHD or I'm depressed, they will get a reply saying that this is only a capitalist construct that should be rejected, that it's natural and shouldn't be medicalized, but regardless of the nature of the problem, it should never be dismissed because in our current productive system, these people are disabled somehow, just like people with untreated astigmatism. People with ADHD and autism are statistically more likely to be unemployed, to have problems at work, and to be fired. The recent shift to TikTok self-diagnosis, which has been the target of strong criticism, is really more akin to creating class consciousness, according to Chapman. It's not a self-contagion. These people were only recognizing the struggles they might have when seeing other people talking about theirs. And that is good, actually. Mostly for people who wouldn't have direct access to a healthcare system. Even if they are wrong in their self-diagnosis, it's not like they will get immediate access to medication before seeing a doctor. Self-diagnosis should never become a personality trait, but it helps people to organize and fight for their right to work and to access the healthcare they need. Okay, I spoke a lot, so now's the part of the video that I will slow down and summarize everything I'm trying to say to get us ready for the juicy part. Yes, you can see the length of the video, you know there is still a juicy part. Basically, we talked about how what is normal and what is pathological are constructed socially to force individuals to conform to the needs of the capital. This is a strategy that has been used by many ruling classes throughout history against lots of marginalized groups, and isn't anything new. The interest that conservatives and right-wingers have in pathologizing trans identities has its foundation in a wish to stop us from existing, to stop us from transitioning. To say that we are mad to be who we are and that we should have a right to decide what to do with our bodies stripped away from us. That we should be forced to fix our pathology and conform. And that is unbelievably dangerous to all of us. The most notable philosopher to look into the power dynamics in pathologizing the mind is Michel Foucault. He spent years and years in mental institutions and studying what happened there. Foucault also helps us to understand how pathologization is defined and enforced by the state. The monopoly the state has over violence also gives to it what Foucault calls biopower, the subjugation of human lives under the rule of the power of the state. The state, the capitalist modern state, has the sovereign right to kill, to decide who lives and who dies, and who is considered mentally insane and needs to be put away. I am not exaggerating when I say that when conservatives claim that transgender people are mentally ill, they do that with only one goal: to exterminate us. Either through forced detransition or through straight out murder. And I can say this for sure because it has happened before. In my own backyard. If I was born 30, 40 years before I was, there is a high likelihood that I would have been murdered by the state, by biopower, for being trans. Today I want to tell you one of the most horrendous stories to ever come out of my home country, Brazil. I wrote this whole video to tell the story of one of the most important books ever written in Latin America. A book called The Brazilian Holocaust.
Joselino Barbacena.
Ah, meu Jesus Cristinho, já me descobriu aqui outra vez. Será impossível. Larga de homem. Ô, muquirana.
I was born very close to a small town in the countryside of Brazil, called Barbacena. It's a calm little city with fresh air, located in a mountain region, and it has been for centuries a resting place for those who wanted to escape the busy and rushed lifestyle of the big Brazilian cities, such as Rio or São Paulo. When I was little, every time a kid from Barbacena would show up, people would start making jokes, asking if they escaped from the mental asylum, asking if they were crazy. The small city that I visited so often as a kid was famous countrywide as the place where crazy people were sent to, and everyone joked about it. From 1957 to 2001, one of the most famous comedy shows on TV was called Mr. Raimundo's School. I remember clearly that whenever the city of Barbacena was mentioned when I was growing up, someone would bring up the character of Joselino Barbacena. He was a shy student, always hiding from the teacher because he didn't want to answer the questions. Always wearing a striped shirt that doesn't remind me of any other striped shirt whatsoever. He would start his answers by talking about his own childhood in Barbacena, and then answer something completely different from what was asked. And everyone would laugh. The whole country would laugh. Because Joselino was a bit cuckoo. Everybody in Brazil kind of knew about Barbacena's Colônia Hospital, or at least had heard about it. This mental asylum had been active for over a century, well through the 60s and 70s, when it was finally closed down in the 80s after a famous Italian psychiatrist visited the place and described it as a concentration camp. The institution had 200 beds, but on average was housing 5,000 patients at any given time. In 2013, when the journalist Daniela Arbex published the book, The Brazilian Holocaust, we had the full dimension of what happened there. It wasn't an asylum. It was an extermination camp for people outside of normalcy from all over the country. More than 60,000 people were executed there. In general, it sounds like an exaggeration when the word Holocaust describes something other than the mass murder of Jews by the Nazis in World War II. In this book, however, its use is accurate. Terribly accurate. At least 60,000 people died within the walls of Colônia. Most of them had been crammed into train wagons and compulsorily hospitalized. When they arrived at Colônia, their heads were shaved and their clothes were torn off. They lost their names and were renamed by the staff. They began and ended there, wrote journalist Eliane Brum in the book's preface.
On Tuesdays and Thursdays, the Madman's train got here. There was nothing different about it. The only thing written on the wagon was Madman's Wagon, right? It was written all over the boards outside. That is to say, there were no regular passengers could ride it, you know? I worked at a station called Aureliano Mourão. There, those poor souls, they would arrive at 7 a.m. and leave at 7 p.m. at that station. So those poor people really suffered. There were some who cried. Others would take a packed lunch. We had a restaurant that provided food for them, for anybody really. Sometimes they ate with their hands, and other times they would eat in a very strange way, just like pigs, you know, something like that. You know, those poor people who came here to the asylum, it was actually really nice to talk to them. You could see that they could speak very well. Some of them would even sing. A lot of people said many of them weren't even crazy. Sometimes they would get drunk, do something stupid, talk about politics or some other dangerous thing, and they'd be deemed as crazy. The authorities would do it, right? From here, they would be sent to the asylum. Well, the way that I saw it was, they were going to suffer, but it's what we could do. I think it's a very difficult mission. Who cares for a madman?
Out of these 60,000 deaths, it's estimated that 70% of them never had a single diagnosis at all, for anything. The height of Colonia was in the 60s through the 80s, when Brazil was under a brutal military dictatorship, and the police had the freedom to make use of violence and abuse its authority with ridiculously few consequences. The law of vagrancy also meant that anyone who was on the streets fooling around could be arrested by the police. And if they were abnormal, they would be stuffed inside a train with other hundreds of people and sent directly to Barbacena, basically a half an hour's drive from my childhood home. This is why earlier I said that I don't care what the technical diagnostics are or what the American Psychiatrists Association says. Because throughout the century that Colonia was open, nobody really cared about diagnostics. If a random cop, an agent of the state, considered you mentally ill, they could just send you there. If you were undesirable or shameful to your family, you would be sent there. Mentally ill people who were sent to Colonia to be exterminated were alcoholics, for example, or homeless people, sex workers, disabled kids, women who didn't want to get married or who lost their virginity before marriage, political opposition of powerful people, gay people, trans people, mostly black people. This is definitely not to say that if Colonia only held people in deep mental suffering, this would be any more okay. This is barbaric treatment to anyone, and I mean anyone. Many did not have clothes, rooms, beds, or sheets to sleep, remained naked outside, even during the night. Restricted feeding, some would eat rats and would drink from the sewage that crossed the pavilions. Beatings and rapes, violent treatment using electroshock. Sometimes the electric charge was so strong that it would collapse the town's entire electric energy system. Furthermore, women that got pregnant in Hospital Colonia had their babies stolen from them. The patients' dead bodies were sold to medical faculties, and when it was not possible to sell them anymore, they were melted in acid to commercialize the bones. I'm just emphasizing that most of the people there didn't have a diagnosis, just to reinforce my message here that the diagnosis doesn't matter. Their goal here is to pathologize anyone they didn't want around, including women and queer identities. The author, Daniela Arbex, also talks about the responsibility the Brazilian state has for what happened in Barbacena. She argues that the Brazilian state failed, and here is where I momentarily disagree with her. I think the state didn't fail in the slightest. On the contrary, it was extremely successful. The state did exactly what it set out to do: exterminate all who were outside of its project of normality. There are many stories I could tell you about the Colonia Hospital, of mothers who had newborn kids taken away only to meet them decades later, of the people who lived nearby, of people who survived, not without scars. But this video is already very long and super demonetized at this point because I think I basically 100%ed all of the bad words that YouTube doesn't like. If you want to hear these stories, I will be linking books and films and essays in the description of this video. There is one story I want to tell you though, because I think it summarizes this entire video very nicely. And it's not a story about the hospital, but it's a story about what being a trans person in the 70s with the looming threat of being put inside a train to Barbacena was like. I love my friends. Really, you guys are all the best. I had academics and neuroscientists helping me review the script. Even more friends are helping me record this thing you're watching now. And when I told them what I was writing about, a good friend sent me a very nice episode of a podcast I love. And that's when I heard the story of Neon Cunha. She was born very close to where I was, but she was born in the 70s. She transitioned when she was 16 and moved with her family to São Paulo. Back in the day, she started to hang out downtown, which would be the place where she could find people like her, atypicals. In the center of the biggest city in Latin America, queer people who had been neglected by their families could find work, housing, and have fun at night. They could also have some very, very scary encounters with the police. And in those days of repression of a totalitarian government, being trans or a sex worker meant that there were no guarantees that you would survive an encounter with the police. Having a formal job gave Neon some sort of security compared to her new friends, but Neon was only 16 when she saw a transgender woman being shot and killed in front of her. Even though she was constantly at risk of extreme violence and even sexual assault at the hands of the police, Neon told this podcast that getting arrested wasn't even the worst thing that could happen to her. There was the asylum. And what I have seen in those places told me, if you get in there, you'll never get out. I know of many women who were sent to the asylum for being lesbians. I know of people that were sent there just by not conforming. It was very, very scary. Neon also talks about her aunt and uncle who were institutionalized in one of these asylums, and she eventually visited them. And she saw it all. The removal of freedom through force, and the electroshocks. There was one very famous strategy that trans people used in the 80s to defend themselves against police brutality. It was called the tongue razor. They would hide a double-edged razor in the hollow cavity inside the mouth, underneath the tongue. Because apparently there's a technique in which the razor would fit neatly and wouldn't hurt. When the police would approach with violence, these women removed the razors and used them not to attack the police, as you might imagine, but they would use them on themselves. They would cut their own hands and show the blood to the police, and the police would cower in fear straight away. Fear of getting infected with HIV. Neon was never HIV positive and neither were most of her friends, but it was the 80s. For the police, being trans or a sex worker was almost a synonym with AIDS. Trans women would weaponize prejudice to protect themselves from violence, to avoid being sent to the asylum. Neon fought hard. Neon fought throughout her entire life, and she won. She was the first woman in Brazil to have her name and gender marker changed without having to present a medical diagnosis for gender dysphoria or any kind of pathologization. I was only able to do it by self-identification in 20 minutes because she did it first. She has been a leading voice in the fight for trans rights in Brazil for decades. She fought and she won. She had her identity recognized by the state without having to fall into the mental illness narrative. And after everything I just said in this video, this fills me up with so much relief. We can fight. We have been fighting for decades, people that came before me and people who will come after. This is a fight that is older and much more important than any British terminally online middle-aged TERF who is going to call me a skin-walking autoganifier in the comments. The anti-asylum fight in Brazil has had so many victories in the last few decades, closing down asylum after asylum, advocating for the humane treatment of people in mental distress, and passing unbelievably important legislation. Barbacena is no more, as is the case for most of the horrible mental institutions in my country. And this wouldn't be possible without a fight. These are scary times. I know most of my audience lives in the United States, so this message is especially to you all who might be anxious about Project 2025 and what might come in the next few months. They are loud, they are getting more and more influential, and they are trying to pathologize us again. They want to see us like that, devoid of self-determination, unable to be as we are. They will post under this video some nasty, horrible comments wishing for me to go through the horrors that trans women before me had. And I will mute every single one of them, relentlessly, because this is about the fight. Hell, Trump might win. Things might become bad. But if Neon could bravely hold her razor underneath her tongue to fight, so can we. The way the American Psychiatrist Association defines a mental illness is much different than what it was a few decades ago. The gays left that socially constructed list in the 90s, and trans people left it a few years ago in 2018. There are no codes for either of those identities in the ICD anymore. Psychiatry today is much less interested in diagnosing illnesses and more in understanding these very complicated mental layouts as a cluster of symptoms. Most importantly, to only treat these symptoms if they are preventing people from living happy and fulfilling lives. In this cool-ass zine, Good Almighty wrote, "Healing is resistance." And that is such a powerful phrase that it could have been the title of this video if YouTube didn't force me to clickbait you. If the ruling class says that the way our bodies work doesn't serve capital, if we are challenging strict binary rules, if we are to be made disabled, then we need to fight, yes, for access to any healthcare neurodiverse people might need. Fight to remind people that a neurodiverse community is a strong community. And whether you are trans, autistic, or a woman who had sex before marriage, if anyone tries to squeeze you up inside a made-up pathology, do what Neon did. Fight.